Hi, y'all. Welcome to the first ever NoHo Business Improvement District virtual on-demand Jane's Walk. We're so excited to partner with local artist, resident, renderer, and preservationist Joan Melnick. She's a wonderful member of the community and last year released her book, The Evolution of a Neighborhood, NoHo. In this book, she's painstakingly recreated renderings based on historical documents, maps, insurance documents, all sorts of wonderful historical artifacts, and created the NoHo of yesteryear. So inside the book, you'll find renderings of what NoHo looked like when it was first built out as one of the most luxurious New York City neighborhoods for the American elite. If you want to go to the next slide. And we're proud to present this Jane's Walk on the evolution of a neighborhood. So here we'll be going through the book and learning more about the research that went into it on Joan's part, taking a look at some of the historic imagery she's created by hand of NoHo in the past and comparing it to the present. This event is part of Jane's Walks, which is an international celebration of the life of Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs is the author of The Death and Life of Great American Cities, a work that remains as relevant today as it did when it was first published in 1961. She's most known for her work in New York City, and she fiercely protected Lower Manhattan, including NoHo, from urban expressways, urban renewal projects, and the urban disinvestment that was occurring at the time. Following her death in 2007, Jane's Walks began in Toronto, her last home. It's since spread all over the globe and is led entirely by volunteers, talking about the neighborhoods, stories, passions, and interesting urban phenomenon that make cities great. In New York City, this event is sponsored and led by the Municipal Arts Society, who coordinates all of the activities going on for this weekend. NoHo is lucky to have 2 live in-person guided walks this year as well. I will link to information on that, but there are many walks all over the city. So make sure to check the links in the description where I'll have information on how to find other Jane's Walks and that sort of thing. This is the first one since 2019 to be fully back with in-person, online, self-guided events. So we're really excited to be part of this celebration. And with that, I'm gonna let Joan take everything from here and walk us through the evolution of a neighborhood, NoHo.
Thank you so very, very much, Chandler. You've been a dream to work with, and your support has been incredible.
Thank you.
One note about Jane's Walk, which I had no idea, but it's an international group. So on this weekend, there are Jane Walks all over the world, and they just keep increasing evidently. So this is all something I didn't realize. And it's sponsored by the Municipal Arts Society. This book took on a life of its own, which I had no idea was in the making. It began in the late 90s and has been resurrected many times. It started out of my curiosity, and you know what they say about curiosity. Well, this opened up Pandora's box for me, and it allowed me to find information not only about my building and my street, which was where the initial curiosity was, but about the whole neighborhood, NoHo, up to Great Joan Street from Astor Place and sided by Broadway and the Bowery. This is the cover of the book. Initially, my curiosity started as to NoHo looking like it was initially when the Dutch settled here in the 1600s and bought this property, this island, from the Native Americans, as we all know what the story is. and turned it into farmland initially. And this is a drawing, because photography didn't exist at the time, of Midtown and what a farm looked like at that point. Names in areas were given to represent what existed. For instance, Bloomingdale's was about the mid city, but it was fields and farms which were blooming. And you'll find a lot of that information shows up in English history more than any other language, because it's, at least for us, because that's our language. This is basically a map showing the ownership of land in those early days of a farm which belonged to a family of Herring. And at some point in the late 1700s, it was subdivided. This area where I am, I hope you can follow, the farmland was broken up into what's known today as NoHo, or north of Houston Street. The drawings, I couldn't help myself because some of them are so beautiful and they were so important to this project. As I mentioned earlier, photography did not exist. And the only way one was able to get some form of description of what something looked like was based on these drawings. And this represents a hotel on the river. And you can tell by the date here, 1642. There was a manual called the Valentine Manual, and it was a diary of city council meetings. And in that diary, which is in the public library, it was my Bible actually, existed drawings and documentation of meetings, city council meetings every month. So it afforded me a great deal of material for research. The other thing that I used, or the other place, was really the New York City archives, which contained deeds. And the deeds went all the way back to the original owners of property. Not, of course, the Native Americans. I have to be careful of my politics here. At any rate, when I was speaking of areas being named after what their function was or what they represented, this is really what Canal Street looked like and why it was called Canal Street. So I'm just throwing in some little tidbits here to just give you a sense of where I was initially as I was researching the project. The other places that I worked in were the New York Historical Society and the Museum of the City of New York, as well as the New York Public Library and the archives. There again was very little information visually of what I wanted, which was really this block. This is Great Jones Street, and this is the Bowery, and this is Broadway. I did not go further south because that would have opened up, no pun intended, a whole other area that I just didn't have the time to do at that point. When I say open up, in the early 1900s, and I'll talk more about that later, This area of Great Jones Street was opened up to allow for the building of the subway. One of the big features in this area pre the arrival of the mansions on Lafayette Place was something called the Vauxhall Gardens. These were beer gardens, summer retreats from the heat and the smells of the city. This was located, this particular part was located on the east, eventually on the east side of Lafayette Place. It did encompass this whole area. It was an amusement park, gardens. There was a band shell. There were places to stroll. It was a park, basically. And it was fashioned after the gardens in London. And London had the same issues in terms of, like any city, of a way for people to escape the heat and the pollution of the urban environment. So this was the initial impetus for the gardens. This is, and it's a watercolor of one of the activities that was occurring in the gardens. And again, this was in London. I found very little information on New York, but it gives you some indication of the fact that this was where people would go to stroll, to be seen, musicians, theater, and libations. You also get a sense of the costume of the time. This is another whole other area where one could go into fashion and how fashion dictated the furniture of the time, the architecture, etc. This is another view of the London Gardens, and they called them the Garden of Pleasure. It didn't have the same kinky connotation to it. I don't think, not having been there, I can't say for sure. What I did was to block out, we're going to start walking hopefully around the east side of Lafayette Place, which was the original name given by John Jacob Astor. He arrived in the 1700s. He built a house right here, and his library was here. There was an alleyway that led to the stables, which were over on Great Jones Street. This was a cul-de-sac at that time. Again, as Chandler mentioned, we the fact that the area was a very elegant area, and we will talk about the west side in a moment. Because there was so little information visually, the maps were very limited, and the maps were based, my map was based on what I could find in the archives of deeds, which allowed me to see what buildings existed on what lots. Initially, we have here on this elevation, Astor's home. The library he built initially was here. It was not a lending library in the early days, but rather a reference library. And it was the impetus for the New York Public Library down the line. This is the gardens, the Vauxhall Gardens, that were left intact. The Other side of the street, they were torn down. We'll go there again in a moment. In my reconstruction, I did not find enough information on the buildings, but I took artistic license with certain information I did find to reconstruct them. Fire maps, or insurance maps, I should say, did not develop until the 50s, the 1850s. And they were the maps that were representing the accuracy of who lived where and what those buildings looked like, to some degree. This area right here is 4th Street, and it runs from the Bowery to Broadway. This structure here was in part a building that became Robert Rauschenberg's home and studio. And this church was the first Episcopalian St. Bartholomew Church. Great Joan Street is here on the right side. This is what the street looks like now. The only remnant that's left, and that has been restored many times, is the library, which is right here, the Astor Library, which is now the home of the Public Theater. It went through many changes, but I'm not going to go through its own evolution. There's a lot for me to cover today. This is the Guathany building. There was a parking lot here up until the early 80s, I believe it was. And this full glass structure was put in its place. The building here is a loft building, as well as the rest of these buildings. This is a parking garage, and this is the DeVries building, which was built in the late 1800s. The thing about this building and the Public Theater is the introduction of terracotta, and it became a very popular, opulent material that had a representation of Renaissance Romanesque architecture. This building here belongs to NYU now. And again, this is the Rauschenberg building, as I would call it. And we have another parking lot here. There was another loft building, which was down for the parking lot. This is the gentleman himself, John Jacob Astor. He was a very interesting man who was considered the wealthiest man and family in New York City. He made his money initially as a fur trader. This is the home he built, which by our standards today is extremely modest. But if you look at Dutch architecture, it too is very modest. It's a modest culture in a sense, in one sense. Here up is the parkway and the walkway road, sorry, to the Bowery for the carriages. This was a building here for a family called Sands. So this is where I started to get my information in terms of the architecture and the idea that the style itself would be somewhat repetitive, maybe taller or shorter, but the idea of the steps having this kind of an entry gave a certain elegance to the building with the columns and the portico. The thing about Mr. Astor, we'll talk a bit in a minute. This is the library that he initially built. And again, his home. So this is the house. Um, as I was building the plans and elevations and perspectives for the book, I was able to use information such as the side view of the house to understand what the space was between the two buildings. So it allowed me to do my own figuring on the plans and elevations. It's very much what I do when I'm doing a rendering, is I'm working first from plan, I go to elevation, then I build a perspective. This is the interior of the library, and if you've been to the public theater, you'll note that there still exists, some of the theaters have the skylights. They may be covered over at this point. I have to go back and take a look again. One of the other activities Mr. Astor was involved in was the trading of opium. So based on some of our semantics today, he was a drug dealer. This came in part as a result of the War of 1812, which cut down on the commerce, because as a fur trader, he needed to make his money, and dealing opium was one of them in the Far East. It was popular actually in England, which I really didn't know, and spread to the Far East, where it was being exported, or imported and exported. I thought this was a very beautiful watercolor, as well as a depiction of what an opium den might look like. Again, as photography developed, this is a photograph of an opium den. And this photograph comes in about the late 1800s. So he wasn't such an angel. He did a lot for the city in terms of real estate, different points of view on that, but he owned a lot of land. And like many developers, he was able to extend his influence. This is once he moved after, excuse me, after he became so wealthy, sorry, which occurred about 20 to 30 years after he moved on Lafayette Place. He eventually moved his family up to the north to Fifth Avenue in the 50s. And this was the house. So the mansions became much larger, a little more opulent. Again, if you've watched The Gilded Age, you'll get more of a sense of what that was like, both visibly and socially. I think socially was even more important, because the social atmosphere was a very specific kind of sociological impact on the way the city developed. This became the Astor home after John died. His sons moved up further. So you can see the detail here on this structure compared to this. And it was nothing for them to rip a building down and put a new one up. We see that here in the city all over as we look at some of the glass structures that are going up, replacing some beautiful buildings. We're now on the west side of Lafayette. and we were just here. Um, Within those 20, 30 years, as I mentioned, this was considered one of the most elegant neighborhoods in the city. And as people became wealthier, like the Astors, and they followed, the Astors were the most influential family in the city. So once John's family moved up north, so did the rest. They all followed because that was the social circuit. The west side had housed, as I mentioned earlier, the Vauxhall Gardens. It became a very elegant looking block during the 30 years that people were living here. This was the Langdon House, and this was built by Astor for his daughter. She lived there off and on, mostly off, for 20 years, and then it was razed. This was another private home, and the colonnades or LaGrange was built here. And I'll show you some better images of that in a moment. Again, we have a lot of greenery, parkland here and here. This again is based on what I could find in the deeds in terms of no structures were here or between the Dutch Reformed Church, which is on the corner of 4th Street. This is going, as the arrow points, towards Broadway. The Dutch Reformed Church is diagonally across from the Episcopalian Church, the St. Bart's. We move south, and this is the Schrimmerhorn home. And the Schrimmerhorns were also a very wealthy family, not as wealthy as the Astors, but they also had, their marriages were arranged for their children so that they could contain the wealth of these families. And they were very specific as to what family was going to marry into what family, so that they could control the money. This is what the block looks like now. And again, this was also, as I was doing this, it was hard to keep up with, excuse me, with a lot of the rebuilding, although this was pretty stationary. This is where the Langdon House was. We go back here, this structure. And part of the colonnades were ripped down. And that was to make room, you can see half of them here, for the Wanamaker building. The building on the corner replaced, this is Great Jones Street here. This building replaced the Schrimmerhorn building that I showed you a moment ago, which is this one. And I have more detailed images in a moment. So here you have, again, that terracotta brick, and this was built in the late 1800s. The same architect that did this did the Dakota, which is on the Upper West Side. This is a detail of the colonnades. And for its time, for its place, it was just totally off the wall. It was just something that people couldn't imagine was being placed here. I certainly can't. The Corinthian column is the most elaborate of the Greek column architecture. And these structures, this was one apartment or a home, had 26 rooms. So there were 9 of them, and I will again show you in a moment what that totally looked like. This was the structure next to it. Again, this gives me a sense of height, width. So I was able to translate that into my plans and elevation. This is a drawing, again, no photographs, of what that colonnade row looked like. And there were 9 units. There were several notables that lived there, Vanderbilt, Tyler, President Tyler's fiance, and he briefly. The Astors, one of the Astor families lived there. Ironically, I worked in a basement bar and restaurant, which was down here somewhere, and it was called the Colonnades. And in the time that I was working there, it was in the 70s, it was one of the hot spots in town. Many artists would come in. There were actors from the public theater, and it was definitely a wonderful place to, well, I didn't think so at the time so much, but to work. So you can get a sense of how elegant this building is, and in a sense, how kind of out of place it is. At the time, this is my rendition of what that block looked like. I did take artistic license and added a lot of trees. I believe that at the time, greenery was very important to people. And so I just put that in, maybe a little less. This is actually the Langdon House. This is the corner of Lafayette and Astor Place, which at that time was called Art Place, or Art Street, sorry. And this is where Astor's daughter lived briefly, 20 years. I mean, when you think about how elaborate that building is for its time. This is what replaced it. This building housed Astor Liquors for many years down on the ground floor. Broadway is over here, and this is Astor, sorry, Lafayette. This was the Wanamaker building here, which replaced the Colonnade. This is looking north from the corner of 4th Street up to Astor. And this was the Dutch Reformed Church. It was made of stone. A lot of the stone, marble rather, was quarried up in Ossining, New York. The steeple was wood, and it burned in the, I believe it was around the late 1840s, but the building itself stayed until the late 1800s.
Can I jump in with a question for you?
Yes, Chandler.
Would the, in the late 1840s into 1850s, when the prominent families began to move out of NoHo, would the churches have followed them further uptown, or did they stay here?
Very good question. St. Bartholomew did move north because they were losing their congregation. And so in order to obviously stay alive, they had to follow. So that's when St. Bart's moved. I believe that the Dutch church, and I really couldn't get much information. It stayed, but it stayed without its steeple. And it was replaced probably in the late 1800s by a loft building, which stands there now, which I'll talk about later. As people moved north, the area became more derelict. And that will change in a few minutes. I'll talk more about that. Well, maybe I'll talk about it right now. As the wealthy became more wealthy, they moved north, leaving a lot of the area derelict for a while. In the process of them gaining their wealth, they did so because of the increase of commerce. And at the same time, paralleling or actually creating that commerce was the Industrial Revolution. And that brought about the invention of steel. It introduced many different forms of commerce that needed factories. And so as these buildings started to disappear, factories came in their place, or replaced them, I should say. And so having the steel and cast iron allowed the construction of the these tall buildings. The elevator, for instance, the Otis elevator developed in the late 1800s. So there was a lot of new inventions that came about that allowed for skyscrapers to be developed, for tall buildings to be developed, and replacing all of the many of the mansions, I should say. I think it was just New York and Chicago where you saw the introduction of skyscrapers. And again, that was a result of the Industrial Revolution. So that also increased the wealth of these families who moved uptown and created the Gilded Age. If you've ever been up to Newport and you look at the mansions that were considered summer bungalows, they were in fact summer homes. And they developed in the early 1900s at the cost of what today is just a pittance. But the craftsmanship and the elegance expressed the kind of money that was being made at that point. This is the plot for the Dutch Reformed Church. And you can see a side elevation. This is 4th Street. And again, the idea of having parkland was very important. This is now what exists today. This is Broadway. And this building houses factories, or housed factories. Now it's mainly offices. I don't believe there's too much residential in this building. I know in this building there is. This is another office building, but this is where you see the introduction of cast iron, or the cast iron buildings, which became very popular and were the factories that had developed at that time, the late 1800s. Some of them had been modernized. This gives you an idea of what the church looked like on that corner. This was a drawing. And this is a photograph that was found in 1860. again, it gives me information. All of this research, which took years to do, allowed me to find and really love so many of the images that I discovered. Oh, there are the trees. Okay, so I didn't lie. All right. But it gave me an indication of what was, for instance, that mansion next to the church, the elevation of the side of the church, allowed me to get the scale of what the building looked like, the height of the building. So that if I took the facade and I see this as a rectangle, I know that the side elevation is also a rectangle. Same height, except for the pediment. So there were little bits of information of that sort that helped me in my drawing. Now this is the northeast side of 4th Street. And this is where we have, this is the north elevation and what it was and what it is. This is the De Beers building. This is the side elevation of a mansion on Lafayette. And as we walk east on 4th Street, we come across the Merchant House Museum, which is here. It had a sister structure which was razed. There is now a big issue going on, has been for a good 10 years, I think, where the Merchant House, which is a beautiful museum, it's the oldest existing structure in New York that has the existing furniture and interiors of a federal period, has been in battle with the owner of this property. And this property is also owned by the same people, the parking lot. And the parking lot runs back. Again, stables or access to stables was very important because people didn't want them in their face. The odor and the dust, etc. At any rate, the parking garage is here and it wraps around to this garage here. The idea of the owner is to rip this down and build a hotel. As I mentioned, it's been in litigation for quite a while, or I shouldn't say litigation, but it's been in court for quite a while. And mainly because the impact of removing the garage here would destroy the interiors of the museum because they're made of plaster. They're very, well, compared to today, rather ornate, but it would destroy the surface materials on the inside of this museum. And there is no way to restore them at, well, it would be at very considerable expense. So there's been a lot of outcry in the community concerning this. Right now, it's on a neutral level as far as I know. This area here was where the water systems from the up north from the reservoirs meet and spread out for the downtown water system. So there are pipes that were put in to replace the old ones, and it's now being turned into a pocket park. I think they're about 3/4 finished with it. It's quite beautiful.
It is. It's supposed to open in October 2022, October of this year.
Oh, great. Thank you, Jenna.
Yeah.
This is another federal building that has been restored. And this apartment building here has been here for good 20 years. Has a swimming pool up on the roof. But the DeVries building was a printing press plant. Now houses Astor Liquors. This is an old drawing of the Merchant Museum or the Treadmill family. And they had something like 8 children. Big families were very important at the time because it allowed for more people to work and make money. Also, babies died because the medical issues were not as strong as today. And this is my rendition of what 4th Street looked like at that time in its early days. The Treadmill house is right here. And this is where the garage is at the moment. You can see the Dutch Reformed Church on the corner of 4th and Lafayette. We are looking west. This area, I could find nothing. So what I did here was just put a park in. Today, it houses what's called the Silk Building. And this is a mixed-use building. It has offices on the lower floors, and the upper floors are co-ops. Keith Richards lived up here at one point. Cher lived here at one point. They all moved onward. This is the southeast part of 4th Street. And this is again what it looked like, my impression. This building is an apartment building. It is today the same building, but it's, from what I understand, apartments that you can actually rent for a short period of time. The rest of the buildings here, again, there was some artistic license because there was very little information. There was, in the plans I discovered, a park briefly. This building was raised for the, let's see, this area in here. And I don't know why I did that, but I omitted the chapel. We'll see that in a moment. That was part of Rauschenberg's property. This was the Bowery Bar restaurant. Prior to that, it was a gas station. It is now under construction for a high-rise office building. So as I was working on the project, it was very hard to use dates that were very specific. So I would say circa, only because the neighborhood kept changing or is still changing. Let's go back one brief second. You can see here, this is the corner of 4th Street and Lafayette. NYU owns that building now. Rauschenberg's property is here, and this is a parking lot now. The property that Rauschenberg's Foundation has had a chapel back here. And again, part of that had to do with these alleyways being a way for the carriages or horsemen to move in and out from not being directly in front of the building in the early days. This is St. Bartholomew Church, and this is Rauschenberg's building. This is looking east to the Bowery. Again, there were images, drawings that I found that showed me the elevation of the church and what was sitting next to it. So I basically took that and recreated what I saw in the drawings. All right, the next interesting part of all of this to me, and here's where I could find that building right here next to St. Bart's. This is the Rauschenberg building here. Oops, sorry. This is the Rauschenberg building here. This is the corner where NYU had built its, well, it wasn't, they bought the structure. This was an orphanage, and it was an orphanage for boys. It had a, as it came down, after it was demolished, it moved to Staten Island, and it became something called Mount Loretto, out near Tauntonville. An irony of mine was that my ex actually worked at Mount Loretto as a volunteer on the weekends. So it's very, life is very strange. It became known as St. Joseph's, and there was a big signage here briefly that was left after it was torn down. There is a whole story about the orphanage, which, you know, leaves room for a whole other exploration. When Rauschenberg was renovating his building, I knew one of his assistants, and he was telling me the story of when they were in the basement and found bones in the basement. And that was related to the orphanage, I believe. Once this was torn down, and that had to do with money. They didn't have enough money to exist here. It became a gas station. And that existed, at least when I moved into the neighborhood, which was in the 60s. And so that gas station probably existed for a good 20, 30 years. The other thing that may have had an impact on this building was the construction of the subway. Now, that's my surmise on this, but I'm not sure. After the gas station disappeared, the parking lot came in, and that still exists right now. There are questions about what's going to happen if the zoning gets placed and a high rise goes in there. So again, another evolution taking place. This diner was directly across the street, and it's on the southeast side of Great Jones Street. The diner was there until the early 2000s, I guess. There was a gas station right behind it. So a lot of gas stations in the neighborhood. This was a very popular, very inexpensive place to eat. All right, we're moving to Great Joan Street now. And this is the block that caused all this trouble for me. Meaning it opened Pandora's box. This is the northwest side of the street, which we'll see in a second. There was the St. Bartholomew Church here. And this is the Bowery here. As I mentioned earlier, this was closed off, and this block down here, which we call Lafayette today, was called Elm Street. This is the corner of the northwest corner of Great Joan Street. And this was the Schrimmelhorn mansion. One of the things I noted here was there was greenery back here and another structure, which I believe is the renovated building across the street from me now. This building existed until it was converted here into the law school for Columbia. And that was a very short period of time. I believe that was from the 1850s to the 1860s when they moved uptown. This is now the Schrimmelhorn building, which houses mainly offices. And in present time, it has the Lafayette Cafe, a very fine restaurant. It originally was a factory when I first moved into the neighborhood, where they made yarn, spinning yarn. It was then turned into a Japanese restaurant. It then became the Time Cafe, and then the Chinatown Bistro, which we miss dearly, but is now Lafayette, and it's quite lovely. This is the corner of the block today. Oh, sorry. This is what the block looks like today. I don't know what happened. And this is the corner of Broadway. There was a bank in here on the ground floor. Now is a sneaker store. There, it's a co-op. In its early days, or my early days of living here, some of the spaces were empty. A very good friend of mine had her studio up here, which was a beautiful studio. As a painter, she worked there for many, many years. The other spaces here were also some studios, art studios. This building here was also housed artists. Danny Christensen was one of the people. Diane Talon was the artist up here. So there was the beginning, or not the beginning, but there were lofts that had evolved from factories that were no longer needed as factories. And this started in the 60s, early, late 50s, where the factories started to move out of the city. Either they became, real estate was too expensive for them, or there was no need for them anymore. Well, the manufacturing changed and went into some other place. As I mentioned about the Schrimmerhorn building is now primarily offices. This is the plan for the northeast block, Great Joan Street. And this is what was. Here's your St. Bartholomew Church, stables. It was not uncommon for the stable boys to live upstairs. And even in some places, they had horses up on the second floor. This was reconstructed by me because there was very little information visually of what those buildings looked like. But I did see on the deeds that people actually did live in these buildings. So again, I took some artistic license on the street. This is what the block looks like today. This is the Lafayette, and this is Great Joan Street. There was another loft building, very much like this one, right next door here. The gas station was here. As I mentioned earlier, as the neighborhood became more derelict and factories moved in, you had the cast iron buildings, which are these right here. Went through their own evolution because as the factories moved out, they afforded artists space to move in. And of course, that evolved. We'll talk about that briefly later. But I had no idea how many artists lived on this block of various forms of art. This is the southern plan of Great Joan Street. Again, here's the Bowery. Here is Broadway and Lafayette. This is the elevation of the southern view of Great Joan Street. This is the corner of Broadway. Family named Russell owned this building. Stables were here. A lot of this block between what is now Lafayette and the Bowery housed stables, horses, carriages, for the mansions on Lafayette Place. Our building is around here. This is where they broke through to create the subways. So this is the area right in here that was torn down. You can see this is the opening for the subway, and stables were here. The building itself was some of it restored. This is the building that I live in. There was a gas station on this corner and a car wash, then turned into a mechanic's garage. This building here was probably part of this building. And this is the corner of Broadway and Great Joan. As this block appears today, you see many of these cast iron buildings that were factories. And again, in the 50s and 60s, as the factories moved out, they afforded spaces for artists. This is a view of this is Broadway, and we're looking east on Broadway, excuse me, on Great Jones Street. This is the building right here where I live today. There was a stable in here, and this was the Russell home. This was the Philip Hone building here. Philip Hone was a diarist and had been mayor of New York. So there were some very prominent people during that time living in the area. And then again, as we moved into this 20th century, the 21st century, that changed. This is the corner of Broadway and Great Jones on the north side. This was where there was a bank. There was also a bank in this building. There was a bank on the other side of the street. So you get a sense of the wealth in the neighborhood at a time when the factories existed, of the kind of commerce that existed as well. This is our building right here. And the building right next door is number 9, Great Jones. This is that corner building, and the bank is down here. This was the turn of the century, and you can get a sense of what the photography does in terms of details. This was breaking through Great Jones Street to accommodate the subway. I love this picture because you don't see many of the construction of subway systems that don't exist anymore. But at that time, the subway was an elevated train, although not here, but on 3rd Avenue, the Bowery. They were tried to protect this building here by putting these stanchions up. I don't think that happened very well. I'll show you in a moment. This is the Schrimmerhorn building over here. So we're looking north. As you can see, I believe we're looking from Bond Street rather, north, south rather. You can see where that building existed right here and no longer exists. This is that Schrimmerhorn building, the Silk building here. So this comes in around the mid-1830s. I couldn't resist some of these drawings that were of design ideas for the subway, and in this case, the elevated train. And you can see the idea of the tube up here. This is a side elevation or a cut through. These drawings were really quite extraordinary. This appears to be that Dutch Reformed church and the building next to it, a mansion. Again, there's not enough information describing, but I can see that the relationship of that steeple that is half burned and the mansion next door with the park in between. And it made sense that the elevation of the elevated train might have been considered for Lafayette Place. Oh, Okay. So what I did was I wanted to take you to one of the things I discovered in my travels and living during the time I lived, which was the 60s and early 70s, was to me some of the most exciting times of being in New York, artistically speaking. It was a time of the late Bohemian period, the Jack Kerouac period, the Cummings, the whole avant-garde. And it was also a time when coming out was more accepted for gays and lesbians. John Vaccaro, who's this gentleman right here, lived next door to me. And he had built the Theater of the Ridiculous. And it was the transformation of theater, traditional theater, although the Dadas, the many of the avant-garde of the 30s also had made some changes, Cocteau, etc. But here in New York, here in my neighborhood, was a revolution taking place. And of course, that revolution was a result of what was happening in the 60s relative to the upheaval of people's feelings about the Vietnam War. And it brought about a great deal of overt activities relative to feelings, political feelings. And so what I did discover as I was doing all of this research was my neighborhood, my block, was filled with so much new rebellious activity, and that suited me just fine. But part of the Theater of the Ridiculous was the beginning, or not the beginning in my experience, of transvestites, cross-dressing, and having it become more acceptable through theater. We also had Rauschenberg, who was living diagonally across from me. And he, of course, was one of the great, in my opinion, one of the great artists of our century. He was able to put politics into his art in a way that no one else was doing specifically. He did assemblages and painted. I mean, it was just extraordinary. So if you're not familiar with his work, I would certainly suggest you explore it at the Met or the Whitney. Well, not so much the Whitney today, but definitely the Met has some beautiful pieces of his. Somebody as almost as contemporary or more contemporary than Rauschenberg was Jean-Michel Basquiat, and he lived down the block. He was a protege of Andy Warhol, and he lived a very, very short life. Carla Maxwell, my neighbor upstairs, who was the artistic director for the Jose Limon Company. It too was a very politically directed dance company and introduced contemporary dance in a way that hadn't really been explored except by maybe Martha Graham. Kurt Lightsey lives in Paris today, pianist, jazz musician, lived next door as well. Charlie Mingus lived on the other side of me, not when I was here though. An amazing bass player, jazz musician. So there was this whole enclave of people living on this block alone that, because of the nature of being an artist, you're working very you're independent pretty much. You live a rather isolated life, except when you're exhibiting, performing in public. But to produce your art, you needed the anonymity, in a sense. Jim Henson lived next door. He's the creator of the Muppets, the Sesame Street. Chuck Close lived a block away on Bond Street, unfortunately passed away. This is a detail of one of his paintings. They were huge, maybe 15 feet. Due to his medical condition, he had to reinvent his studio to accommodate his paralysis. So there was an incredible metamorphosis that took place in the neighborhood from the time it was this very elegant neighborhood to what it is today, and still is. And this is my work. So architecture is definitely part of my blood, among other things. I want to thank you very much. I hope that you didn't get too lost on the tour, and you'll be able to see this on YouTube, and I'll let Chandler take it from here.
Awesome. I'm gonna give Joan a round of applause, and if you're watching virtually on demand with us, I hope you will as well. Joan, thank you so much for that wonderful tour through the last 200 years of NoHo history. Your renderings are amazing, and seeing the neighborhood as it was and into what it became has just been incredible. I want to thank you so much for your time and your research. We will put in the description information on how to buy Joan's book. So all of the renderings created that you saw today are part of her book, The Evolution of a Neighborhood NoHo. I have my copy right here, and I'll include information on how to buy a copy for yourself. It's absolutely incredible, filled with Joan's incredible drawings. You can just sit there and pore over them for hours at a time. Like we opened with, this is part of Jane's Walk 2022. We are very excited to be part of this event, and I am with the NoHo Business Improvement District. We're really thrilled to be working with Joan Melnick, who is a longtime NoHo resident. And like many of the artists mentioned at the end, she also, I want to add, has an incredible story and history. Joan created 2 loft spaces from the raw factory form into what they are now, and has been a part of the neighborhood for so many years. She's lived an incredibly fascinating life. And if you want to learn more about Joan, I have a link in the description below with our spotlight from earlier this year on Joan. So I definitely recommend checking that out. It has more NoHo tidbits and some of her personal history in the neighborhood as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for joining Jane's Walks.